Hi, I'm Mike Fleming,
And I am Barb Chose.
and this is the Finding Healthy Church podcast. Here at this podcast, we're all about church health. Now, you might be thinking that's a pretty niche topic, right? And it's just one aspect of the Christian life, but we would encourage you to consider if it isn't the Christian life. After all, what was God's big idea when he created? It was to have, we talked about this in a previous episode,
Right.
a many in one community, a many
Right.
in one, just like him that imaged him. Well, what is that? That's the church, a many in one community. That was his big idea. That's why he created. You might think a podcast about church is a niche topic in the realm of Christianity, but really it is Christianity. Right,
It
Barb?
is.
Am I
Yep,
right about
it
that?
is. I mean, I think from the beginning, this is the end game in one sense. That was his, I won't say his dream, his aspiration, or his desire was to, in this creation of life, of our lives, to create his nature. So there is a plurality that existed from the beginning of time and an inclusion of relationships.
Yeah, and if we follow the biblical story all the way through, as you said, I love that. I love that phrase, the end game. The end game of the biblical story was to create what Paul called the new humanity.
Mm-hmm.
It was a new race, a new species, a DNA that was God's himself inserted into us by the Holy Spirit. Here's a fun fact that I learned recently. The term church isn't actually like a biblical term for all the Christians in the world. A lot of times we'll say like the church, like the universal church, all the Christians in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But church in the Greek, ekklesia, actually just means a gathering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all the Christians in the world can't gather, so there is no such thing as the universal church. There is a new humanity, and that's what people mean by that term.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a new race, a new species, a new humanity that has God's very own life and DNA in it.
Right, right. You know, my husband says this was not, the church was not a plan B. It was the plan all along, and it's just we've messed it up along the way and lost the vision of it along the way. And so I think one of the things you and I are trying to talk about is to try and restore, revive, reinitiate, at least for people to consider that the church was not just something to do.
Yeah, it wasn't just like something you join after you get saved, right? It was like, well, that's true. It wasn't. That's not what it is. It's something much higher and deeper.
Right. You're actually born into a family at the time you're baptized, or you say yes, you're married, or if you want to see it as not being born into, you're married into, you're marrying Jesus at the point you say yes. And so you're marrying into a family.
Yeah.
Not just to a one person.
Right. Yeah. And I heard, there's many ways you can express God's purpose. It's like a diamond you can turn and look at many different ways. One of the ways I really have appreciated, because it's very simple, is God's purpose was he wanted to have children.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted other beings that received his kind of life and lived by his kind of life. That's what children are. They get our life and they live it and they learn and they watch us and they act like us and all that kind of thing.
Yep. But you also love them. And so one of the things is God is, when you say God is love and that his intent is to love, the issue with that is there's a choice. It's not, a lot of times people will say, why is the world so messed up? And part of it is it's because we have a choice. We have free will. And that comes with loving. If you make it that God is not a love, that his word is not about loving, you can accuse him of all the wrong that's gone on in the world. It's kind of like when you're a parent and your child misbehaves. That's not what you want, but it happens because you aren't forcing them to behave a certain way. And in loving, there is that freedom of choice. And sometimes we make the wrong choices. That's what happens in the nature of love.
you can see just how we're going off on this tangent here.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
my point at the beginning that the church really is the end game, the ultimate. It's not a niche topic in Christianity. It's once we get saved, it's like what we're called to. It's what
Right.
it's what we become part of. And so that's why we're here. It's ultra important that we do it in a healthy way. And we've been on separate journeys, but similar journeys in many ways. And so we want to share that with you. So that was about the longest introduction we've done so far. But hey, we never know. We never know where these introductions are going to go. So.
Nope.
Getting into what this episode is going to be about, and we're in the midst of a series about the nature and purpose of the church. We're in part 6. I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, go back and listen to the first 5 parts at least. We have talked about the fact that understanding the nature and purpose of the church is key for everything else we're going to talk about. It's key for a church's life together to be in alignment. So we've talked about God's nature as an eternal community of love. We've talked about the creation of mankind and how that gives insight into this topic. The fall of mankind does. There's many pictures in the scriptures of many in oneness, the human body, the tabernacle, the temple. And then we've gotten a little more practical, especially in the last episode. We talked about how to be built together in community to actually express or live out the oneness that is true of us in the spiritual realm. It's meant to come out. It's meant to be manifested, expressed on the earth. And so in this episode, we're going to transition a little bit to talking about different understandings of the idea of church, and specifically 2 camps. One camp is a biblical view or understanding of church, and the other camp is a traditional views. What I mean by traditional views is anything that you really can't trace back to the Bible, right? It's not part of the story of the early Christians. It's not part of, I'd just say the biblical story. You don't find it there. Now, it doesn't mean if we do something or if we see the church as something, doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it's important to identify whether something's biblical or traditional, because it can be really insightful into tracing back whether something is healthy or unhealthy.
Right. It also can be that we can take the scriptures and we can interpret them to fit the culture of the time. And so those are the things we have to make sure that, as we're wanting to talk about that, there's things that have become traditional, but maybe they've lost the real intention of why those things are to be done or expressed.
Yeah, and you find, I think in a lot of cultures, that is the big challenge. Like a lot of the letters in the New Testament are like Paul writing about, hey, you guys, you're part of a new family, a new nation, a different way of life, a new kingdom. You're in the kingdom of God. You're not of the world, but you guys keep getting affected and you keep doing things like the world does them, right? Mm-hmm. And so he keeps having to write letters like, why we keep doing this? Why we keep doing this? And honestly, not much has changed, right? Like if you look at the Christian landscape, at least where we live, I think an honest assessment would be like, yeah, we kind of do the same thing, right? Like we borrow a lot from culture and then, we wonder why we're not healthier kind of a thing, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times we don't even know, like we might be borrowing from something from culture, but we don't even know that it's unhealthy.
Right.
Or that it's not God's will, right?
Right. It's like I've been watching there's a lot of reels that you see on social media that talk about, did God say this? Is this what it was said? And people go, no, that's not what it says. It says, you should deny yourself, So there's just a lot of those kinds of things that I think we have. There was a book that was written a long, long time ago by John White, who's a Christian pastor and psychiatrist, but the book was titled Flirting with the World. And in the book, he talks about how the church has flirted with the world and not even aware of those things that have penetrated into Christianity that are not necessarily biblical.
And some of those things are sinful and some of those things might just be neutral. I don't know, like.
Sure.
We just have to have an honest assessment, I think, is kind of what I'm thinking.
Right.
I do know one thing, like tradition, what tends to happen is like man comes up with these traditions or borrows things from culture, etc. And then tradition interprets the Bible so that the tradition labels itself as biblical.
Mm-hmm.
So what you can do a lot of times is take a tradition, then you can go find biblical passages that seem to support that tradition, especially if you take them out of context. You know, you use what many call a cut and paste doctrine. You might go and cut out 20 verses, I'll stick them all on a page, and then say, look, the Bible teaches that we should be doing this way, you know,
right.
or this is true. And then especially in our language, like in English translations, like many English translations, as helpful as they are and as good-hearted as the translations, the translators were, there can simply be some bad words used for what the author was trying to communicate, but it doesn't really come across that way when we read it, you know, in our culture. And so we make stuff. I think a couple examples of what I'm talking about, you know, where tradition interprets the Bible. In our culture, a church is a building you go to every Sunday morning, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So when we say, hey, we're going to church or whatever, we think of a building that we go to. That's become biblical because the Bible says, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together, right? So someone might go and take that verse and say, see, you should be going to the building every Sunday.
Right.
The problem is church buildings didn't exist for the first 300 years of the church. So it's really not biblical. It's just a tradition that ended up happening for different reasons that we won't necessarily get into right now. But that's a good example of like what happens typically.
Yep. Well, we learned that quite a long while ago. So whenever we say, if we're going to go and gather with another people somewhere, we'll say we're going to go gather with the church that meets at, you know.
Yeah. That's biblical because every time Paul wrote, he said to the church that meets here in the city, right? To the church in Ephesus, to the church in wherever. Yeah. Right.
And we've always said, well, we're going to go over to the church building. That's kind of, we've sort of had that link. We've learned that lingo in our life together as a congregation to know that exactly the church is not a building, you know?
Yeah, sure. I think another one that comes to mind is, like the concept of what it means to do church or go to church or have a church gathering. Mostly the traditional thing right now is like sitting and listening to the same person give lectures about the Bible week after week, right? That's become a biblical thing because the Bible says to preach the word, right? Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, preach the word, it's all over the place. How important the word of God is, etc. The problem is like preaching sermons every week is actually not in the Bible. It's not a biblical concept. It comes from like Greek oratory and rhetoric where they used to actually put on shows. In that time, it was considered like a big time skill. Like celebrities were people that could talk well and convince people of things and persuade people of things and entertain people through giving speeches, basically.
Yeah, I think, it's, again, we're trying to help people understand what you might want to call were the traditions of the time of the early church versus how that has sort of changed into the future. One of the other things is not just the fact that you have a pastor who does it all, not just teaches, but preaches and counsels and pastors and administrates and all of that, when basically it's sort of the gifts, in Ephesians, Paul is pretty clear about the fact that all of that exists not within just one person or one member, but within the body. And it takes time for the body to sit and know each other and learn about each other's gifts and share that. So I think there's a much fuller body life
You're saying that the traditional view of church would have a special guy that was talented enough to preach, counsel, administrate, etc., where the biblical view of church would have more of a spread out, shared responsibility between many people who had different gifts, and they would discern like who has what gifts, who does God work through how, and then they would do those functions and responsibilities as God empowered them to.
Yeah. And how those decisions are made. Are they just made by one person or 5 people, or where does the congregation's participation come along? Those kinds of decisions. And it's not to say that there are those who are wiser, can help those who may not be as wise to listen as to the reasoning why they understand certain gifts and certain people, and need to listen well to those ideas and those decisions, but they get to participate in it. And I think that's what lends to a body life being very full, and where people are really beginning to learn what it means to be, I think, the church as God intended.
I have a list here of 5 what I'm calling traditional understandings of church, just to give us a taste of what I mean by that, or how people tend to view what church is that are traditional ways and not necessarily biblical. Number 1 is they view church as like a learning center. So we've probably all been around Christians where you ask them like what church they go to, or they switch churches or whatever. And they talk about how I was going there, but I didn't feel like I was getting fed. And so I switched churches. And so there's this view of the church as like a learning center. It's like a place you go to get something, to learn something, to help you in your growth with God. And you're looking for the best you're looking for the best resource. And so that's just the general mindset of like the church is where I go to learn something. Number 2, the church is a theater where you witness Christian activities. So this became kind of big with, in the last few decades, the seeker-sensitive movement. It was like, all right, we're going to build big stages. We're going to put on big productions. The worship is like a rock concert. The preaching is a very talented motivational speaker that leaves you emotionally charged when they're done. And so you go for a show and you get something from that show. It's almost like going to a TED Talk, or, going to a movie or whatever. Going to a Broadway musical, whatever. And you get something out of those things, right? Like you get an experience out of those things. Number 3, a corporation. Basically, the church is something that provides like Christian goods and services. You go and you pick and choose what you want to do. I should say it's like a corporation where, there's a staff, usually with a board of directors, a CEO, a staff, and their job is to create an experience for you. And we pay them to do that. We purchase those goods and services by the money we give to keep the whole thing running. Number 4 is a social club. You go, it's a place, the church is a place to go to have interaction with people with similar beliefs. It's a way to bring people together from our city, from our neighborhood, to meet with Christians, to develop relationships, develop friendships, and to keep those friendships going. It's a place where, we meet and we interact and we worship God and we do things that we think we should be doing. And number 5 is a shopping mall. A church is a place where they develop programs where you can take your family, and they got something for the kids, they got something for you, and you pick and choose like what's good for us and our growth. And then you do the things you want to do and you don't do the things you don't want to do. Yeah. So those are 5. What do you think of those, Barb? Am I missing any that come to mind for you?
No, I think that's pretty good group of things. I think what I feel like is they all are very similar in, again, what is the end game? What is the end game in each one of those mindsets or understandings that people choose to be a part of a congregation? So it's a learning center. You're looking for somewhere to get fed. Well, what do you do after you get fed? Do you do something with it? Or is it just stuff you've learned and you go, that's great? Jesus says, go and make disciples. So there's something about that. It's like, does discipleship end after I say yes to Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
And so all of those things may be helpful things, may even be helpful if there is the right end game.
Yeah, it seems like end game now is like with all 5 of these.
It's to satisfy myself. It's to satisfy my relationship with God vertically. Mm-hmm. And I lose the fact that all of this should initiate a partnership with the Lord to live it out horizontally, to be his partner in making disciples, to be his partner in feeding the hungry. You look at Matthew 25, and I think he's very clear about the sheep and the goats.
Right, but I think the mindset I've seen in a lot of these 5 examples, church is something just like a relationship with God, and going to church is something that I do. And then you talked about the end game. The end game is to take what I learned there or what I experienced there and go have a happy life.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Because we have been convinced that being in a relationship with Jesus leads to a better life. It leads to a happier life. And so that's the end game, is like, I could choose no Jesus or I could choose Jesus.
Right.
And so I've been convinced that choosing Jesus is better.
Right.
Right. I've been convinced I am a sinner. I don't want to spend eternity in hell. Like all the things that are preached in the gospel of salvation. It's like, okay, now what do we do with that? We go live a happier life.
Right.
And that's where
exactly. Right. I think that's where, when I say that people have the wrong end game in how you think what that's supposed to do. It's supposed to build you up so that you can go out and live as Jesus lived, in the midst of all the trials and the tribulations, to be his presence in the world. And we can't do it by ourselves. That's the other thing, that's why the church is so important. But where it's become anemic is people don't have the kind of relationships that would help us through those things. I heard somebody say that the church is the only institution that shoots its wounded.
Right.
Or one of the few. Mm-hmm. But I think it's like when people are struggling, when people are really needing the strength of Jesus to get them through a tough time, and it may be because of their own sin, that the church is the last place that they would go. Mm-hmm. And it should be the first place. Yeah,
so we want to help try to change that.
Yes.
In whatever small way we can. I will say this, though, and we'll wrap up with this for this episode. We got more to talk about on this, but our time's almost up. So things seem to be shifting. I've seen, I think in our culture, a shift maybe 20-ish years ago. I don't know if that's exactly right, but I think it mirrors like the advent of the internet, or the invention of the internet. Around when I was in my 20s, I got my hands on a book that wasn't, mass produced, but I got my hands on it about the topic of like taking a look at the church. And you were way ahead of your time. You were like 1978.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there've been waves, right? Like there was the Jesus movement, like in the 60s, things like that. There've been movements, but I feel like there have been some shifts that have been really interesting in recent decades. And like one of them is like books that have been published in the last 20 years and like mass marketed. There might have been there definitely were books in the past, but weren't mass marketed by like big publishers because they wouldn't touch them. They wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole, to be honest.
Well, or they were just unknown, they're unknown authors of the time or something like that, So,
right.
Because some of these books that we're going to be talking about are folks that we read 45, 50 years ago that were very informative in how we began our life together as a congregation. So, it goes all the way back. You could just go as far back as Bonhoeffer in the late, in the 40s. So,
yeah, but the thing about, I think, the internet and this kind of generation right now, every major invention changes culture in different ways. But the thing about the internet is like information is not really controlled as much anymore. Like I can go, like in the olden days, like if you wanted to understand the Bible and God, you went to whoever was in your town. It's like, it took forever to travel places that were to get access to information elsewhere. And so you went to whoever that trusted authority was. And it's like, whatever they know and think, that's kind of what you know and think. Or
yeah, I think you're right about that. I think, we have so much with the internet. We do have our hands of, there's so much more availability to the resources, like you said, than we did before. Because it's worldwide, and you're right.
And that's been good or bad, neither or. I mean, it's created a Christian celebrity culture, which isn't necessarily good, but it's also created access to, you can find ultra great information, ultra great teaching. Like my main sources of teaching come from people that live in Florida and Oregon. Those are my two main sources. And I live in Ohio,
right.
And so like, I've been able to pick and choose. Like I don't learn most of my stuff from the pastor at my church.
Right.
God bless him. I think he's great, but he's not on the level of knowledge and teaching that these other people I found just because of the internet are on. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so all that to say, things seem to be shifting in terms of more and more Christians are hungry to discover a biblical picture of the church. More Christians than ever are questioning the traditional pictures or views of church that we talked about as a learning center or theater, et cetera. And their church experience isn't really aligning with what they read about in their Bibles. Right? So if most of their church experience is traditional and they read their Bibles and they're like, wait, we're doing this, that doesn't really match. And so that's why things seem to be shifting. People seem to be open to exploring, like, let's just talk more about this and explore this and get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think is important is people are willing to take the time to engage, those conversations with people who are exploring and who are wondering and are willing to be, I think, on the journey with that person or those persons as they're trying to find their way or discover who their relationship with Jesus is. So I think that's really important. I think it really does, if the church is healthy and functioning as it should, I think that example helps folks understand they have this bird's eye view or experience of, oh, okay, so this is what it means. This is what it means to love God, love the world, love one another, what God intended.
All right. So next time we're going to dive deeper into this. What is a biblical understanding of a church? We want to discern. It's healthy for people and churches to discern between traditional and biblical views of the church, because how you think about the church is the foundation for how you're going to do church.
And I think just to let folks, I think this is not something new that you and I have come up with. I mean, so many of our resources, like we said, are from books and information that were written 40, 50 years ago. So this has been at least a subject that's been in the world for a long time. So it's not like we're bringing up new things. It's not that we don't have new things, but so much of what we're bringing up is that, no, there are people that were 40, 50, 60 that are raising or raised the same kinds of issues or wonderings or understandings, maybe,
like I said earlier, it's just like Paul wrote letters because the same things were going on in the early church that are going on today. It's no different.
No, exactly.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle between the world and its system and the kingdom.
Yes.
Okay, if you want, you can contact us by emailing Mike, M-I-K-E, at findinghealthychurch.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter at findinghealthychurch.com for updates and other resources. And like I said, next time we're going to be diving into what is a biblical view of the church.
You ask yourself that question? Why do you try but coming up with these inventions? Do you know why? Did you ask yourself that question? Why do you try?
Thanks for listening to the show. If what you heard was helpful, hit the subscribe button and notification bell. Leave us a comment and check out these other episodes.